What does almost every single global empire in history have in common? See, the majority of global superpowers at some point have occupied Egypt. Think about it. The Persians, Alexander, the Romans, the Arabs, the Ottomans, the French and the British. Even the Nazis made an attempt on the country. Obviously, not every global empire has occupied Egypt. But still, Egypt sits on golden real estate between the Mediterranean and Red Seas, between Africa and Asia. And that's why this is the first episode of Egypt's recent history. Recent being from 1798. Why 1798? Well, something important happened that year. See, in 1798, this man, French General Napoleon Bonaparte, invaded Egypt. Why? Well, in simple terms, Napoleon wanted a way to reach India. In other words, geography. The country's location between these two seas would, time and again, pique the interests of foreign powers. So, he landed at Alexandria and took over the country. Now, I'm sure you're asking right now, was there no resistance? Was nobody ruling Egypt at the time? Obviously, yeah. Egypt was ruled by the Turkish Ottoman Empire. But the Ottomans didn't exactly rule the country directly. There was a group of people in Egypt who had more influence than the Turks. Those people were called the Mamlukes. Long story short, the Mamlukes had a lot of influence in Egypt, and when Napoleon showed up in 1798, he faced the Mamlukes. The thing is though, the Mamlukes weren't exactly successful. Napoleon beat them, and eventually entered Cairo about 3 weeks after making landfall. Alright, so Napoleon is now effectively the king of Egypt. One thing we need to understand though is the dynamic that was at play. See, Egypt is a very, very religious country. The nation is majority Muslim, but has a significant Christian population. Napoleon, being smart, was keenly aware of Islam. From the beginning of the campaign, Napoleon portrayed himself as a liberator, not just towards the Egyptians, but even towards the French. When he landed at Alexandria, Napoleon told his troops to respect the Muslims, saying, "Treat them as you treated the Jews, the Italians, respect their muftis and their imams as you respected their rabbis and bishops." That was important because Egypt and France were, culturally speaking, coming from two different worlds. France was coming right off the Enlightenment, which toyed with new and sometimes controversial ideas, and had just undergone a revolution which heavily attacked the religious establishment. Egypt, on the other hand, was a seat of Islamic learning, and while there were great Islamic scholars, their ideas were not as controversial as the French's. Napoleon therefore had to bridge between these two cultures, and as I said, he did that by portraying himself as liberating the Egyptians from Mamluk and Ottoman rule. He also tried to be friendly with the Muslims. He kept praising Islam and even helped prepare celebrations of the Prophet Muhammad's birthday. Religion, especially Islam, is a very important thing in Egypt. And despite Napoleon's overtures, the Egyptians didn't trust him. One of these Egyptians was named Abdul Rahman Al-Jabarti. Al-Jabarti was an Egyptian Muslim scholar and historian, and he did not like the French and didn't really trust them. But Al-Jabarti had a hot take. If you made him choose between the French and the Ottomans, he would have said the French. This was a very, very interesting take, and it reflects what made the French campaign so important to Egypt. It wasn't that the French taught the Egyptian civilization, it was that the French invasion launched a series of events that would prove crucial to the country's modernization, as we shall see in the next few episodes. Al-Jabarti's take on the French reflects this. If you ask them what was wrong with the Ottomans, Ottoman rule, in Al-Jabarti's opinion, was arrogant, cruel, and tyrannical. And he went one step further, saying that corrupt and backward rule was un-Islamic. And that's what made the French campaign so important. It destabilized the system that had been in place for centuries, and did so in a European taste. Still though, that didn't mean that Al-Jabarti or the Egyptians liked Napoleon. The Egyptians didn't really trust Napoleon, as I said, and eventually they would rise up. The people in Cairo began spreading weapons and attacking any French they encountered, and crowds tried to stop Napoleon from entering the city gates. Napoleon, in response, cracked down, setting up cannons in the citadel of Saladin. He fired on rebels and destroyed their fortifications. By the end, 5,000 to 6,000 Egyptians were dead or wounded. So, back to the big picture. The French occupied most of the country, but Egypt is geographically split between Lower Egypt in the north and Upper Egypt in the south. And the Mamluks had retreated to Upper Egypt, from where they were fighting for their survival. The country, though, as I said, is in a central location, and the Mamluks took advantage of that. They mobilized support from the Arabian Peninsula and the Nubia near Sudan. This mobilization was so important that the French thought it was necessary to take over a certain city on the Red Sea to stop reinforcements coming in from Mecca. Nonetheless, despite relative French successes, things were going horribly for Napoleon. The Egyptians were revolting and coexistence was out the window. And on top of that, there was another aspect I didn't really talk about. See, while France was invading Egypt, a certain somebody was watching, and that somebody was named Great Britain. The British went and sunk the French navy off the Egyptian coast. That was an absolute disaster for Napoleon. This meant that he, thousands of miles away from France, had no supply lines to the homeland, and was effectively trapped. And that's when the Ottomans decided to get in. But again, using Egypt's central location, Napoleon went and launched another campaign into Palestine to face the Ottoman armies head-on. And for a time, he was relatively successful. But the Ottomans, backed by the British, were still able to pressure the French, meaning Napoleon had to retreat. So Napoleon went back to Egypt. He asked the French government for reinforcements. But it turns out that France was in chaos. Several countries had declared war on it, and the economy was in a crisis. So Napoleon kind of quietly left. Napoleon left in the year 1799, but the French stayed for 2 more years. In the end, they would be defeated by a joint British and Ottoman effort. And one of the people who were sent to fight on behalf of the Ottomans was this man, Muhammad Ali. You need to remember this name, because this man would prove to be one of the most important leaders, perhaps in all of Egyptian history. And he wasn't even Egyptian. So why was he so important? Stay tuned for the next episode to find out. Until then, thank you for watching.